Hello, friends. I think we're all ready to go now. Uh-oh. It says maybe I don't have good audio. Let's see what happens here. I think we're all set. But we gotta wait until everything catches up. So, hello. I'm seeing folks in the chat already. There we go. Let me know if you can't hear me or if anything seems weird, but I think we should be good to go. Hello, Nikki and Ellis and Carolyn and Jude and Melissa and Taylor and Jade. Robin and Brian and Julia. Oh my gosh. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. Yay. I am pumped. It's Bible study time. I have to flip this over. Oh, good. Robin's giving a thumbs up on the audio. Great news. Great news. Cool. Well, hello everybody. I'm so glad to see you. Yay. Thanks for bearing with me as I got started a couple minutes late tonight. I got wrapped up in reading a commentary about this passage and lost track of time for a second. So glad to be here. Glad you're here. How are you all doing? This is the nice thing about chat is you can actually say like how you're doing. It's not just me talking to a video that's pre-recorded. I hope you're all doing okay. Let me know how you're doing. I know it's weird asking that these days. I was realizing that I don't know how many of you got a chance to watch our game night that we had on Friday. It was so much fun. But I kept asking all the guests, how are you? When they would come in and they would be like, well, the world's on fire, but we're alive. So I know it's kind of a weird question to ask right now. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to be here. Let's see. Some things before we get started with our text tonight and get into our... there we go. Now it says we have an excellent connection. Before we get into our actual Bible study stuff for the night, a couple announcements. The first announcement is that we've got 2 more days left in the Trans and Christian, throwback, 2 days left in the Transmission Ministry Collective funding drive. So that's the big news right now. Oh, good. I'm glad I'm actually seeing people. Good. Robin is doing good. Did a lot of things today. Same. I'm sorry you broke your sleep schedule, Ellis. That sucks. Carolyn, yay, finals are over. Hurrah! And I'm glad you like game night, Nikki. So speaking of game night, if you didn't get a chance to watch game night, it is still up on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it whenever you want. It's like an hour and 15 minutes of a bunch of goofy people being awesome. And it was so much fun, and I'm so glad we did it. So the reason that we did it is, of course, for the fundraiser. And one of the, so since we've got 2 days left of the fundraiser, we've done a special thing, and I wonder if I can do this in the chat. We'll see if that works. That should throw up a link for us, but we'll see. One of the things that we're doing, since it's the last couple of days of the fundraiser, is we've got a special perk up where you get 2 of the new awesome Transmission Ministry Collective stickers for $20, and it's really cute. It's a really cute sticker. I like it a lot. We'll see if this gives up the link. I don't know if it's going to. I might have to just put the actual link in the chat because it doesn't look like the link thing is working at the moment. So I'll do that right now. Oh no, okay. Ellis said that the commands weren't working the other night either. That is good to know. I will have to fix that. So I just put the link in the chat for our Indiegogo. We've got 2 days left. We're trying to get to the halfway point. We're trying to get to $7,500. That's the idea. Oh, thank you, Ellis, for doing that. And we've got this awesome thing going on. It used to be that for the $25 perk, you would get a sticker and a handwritten letter, and we're doing a special thing for just the next 2 days where you can do a $20 perk and get 2 stickers. So that's up, and if you want to learn more about that and the fundraiser and what we're doing, go over there. So now that we've done all that spiel, let's get on with what's happening, which is Bible study. We are going to talk about the story of the Good Samaritan. And the reason that I picked this particular passage tonight is that I have been thinking a lot about what it means to be a good neighbor in a world that is pretty scary right now for a lot of us, and what it means to act with love for others when things are so scary and things are like you never really quite know what to do, it seems like. So I've been thinking a lot about being a good neighbor, and then I was like, oh, remember we have the whole story in the Bible about who is my neighbor and what a good neighbor looks like, so maybe we should read that story. I also, quite a while ago, over on my personal channel, I did a video about the Good Samaritan and this story, but that was probably 2 years ago now, if not more. And so I thought it was about time to revisit this passage. So tonight we are going to be reading the story of the Good Samaritan, which exists in Luke chapter 10. Excuse me. Oh good, it's Julia's favorite story. I love that. So Luke chapter 10 is where we're going to be going tonight. Let me put up the little text thingy. There we go. Oh, perfect. Perfect. It's in the dark of my living room over here. Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one with this story on their mind. Nikki's also been thinking about it. So good. This is a good time for us to dig into the story. The story itself is actually not that long. It's kind of funny thinking about this story because it's such a classic story. It's probably up there with the prodigal son. That's probably, like, those are probably Jesus's two most famous stories that, like, you don't have to be a Christian to know these stories. They're just part of our zeitgeist, at least in sort of the Western Christian-dominated world. But it's I always think that the story is going to be longer than it is because we have so many versions of the story in our popular culture. I'm always like, oh, it's certainly going to be like a whole chapter long. No, it's not. Like the story about the parable about the sower who sows all the seeds. That parable is way longer than this one, and we don't think about that one as often, it feels like. So anyways, interesting thoughts on parables. So let's get into it. Luke chapter 10 is where we are. We're going to be reading verses 25 through 37. And I, as per usual, I'm going to be reading in the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV. But if you have a different version that you really like to read in, read along in that version. And if you find things that are different from what I'm reading, and it seems like, wow, that's weird, I wonder why they did that, or it seems like really different from what I'm reading, bring it up in the chat, because we love to know about those translational differences. So let me scoot on over to Luke 10. We are going to just read, let's see, should we do this in chunks or should we do this whole thing? Let's do this in two chunks, because that's how I've got it in the NRSV that I'm reading in here, and I think it kind of makes sense. So we're going to read verses 25 through 28 first, and then we're going to stop for a second and talk a little bit about it. So, starting Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. To give you some context for this, Jesus is in a pretty public place. He's just been talking with the disciples, so that's kind of where we are. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." So that's the very first part of this story. It's like a question and answer session with this particular person that Jesus is talking with. Are there any things that stand out to you about this very first section? Any questions that come up? Anything you find different in translations? One of the things that I noticed as I was going through this text is that in the other two Gospels that share a lot of the stories with Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all share a whole bunch of stories. They're called the Synoptic Gospels. And in Matthew and Mark, the question that Jesus is asked kind of around this same issue is, which commandment is the greatest, or which commandment is the first? That's the question that Jesus is asked. And in this particular version, in Luke's version, Jesus is asked, what do I do to get eternal life? Which is very different from those questions about which commandment is the most important. I think maybe in the end, what the question is getting at is maybe the same. Like, what is the most important thing for me to do, right? That's kind of the question. But it's interesting that in Matthew and Mark, the question is, what's the most important commandment? And in Luke, it's, what do I do to get eternal life? So there's a little bit of a difference there between the three Gospels. Is there anything else that stands out to you all? I think that sense of eternal life, how do I get eternal life, is something that's maybe more specific to Luke's Gospel than the other Gospels. That Luke is really all about like life abundant, life eternal. Well, John is as well, but life eternal and like the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven coming here. Like that's very Luke, it feels like. So it's interesting to see that difference. So the other thing that I had a question about that I'm actually going to look up right along with you is in Luke 10 verse 25, where it says a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. It's funny to think about because like that's what a lawyer is somebody who's like well versed in the law, right? But I'm interested by that translation of lawyer. Like what is meant by a lawyer? Because usually when we think of lawyers, we think of people who do like bankruptcy law and like sue people when you get hurt when you're not supposed to. I'm not sure that's the same kind of lawyer we're talking about here. So I'm going to look up Luke 10, verse 25 in my language dictionary here and look at what it says in the Greek, because I'm interested to know. The word we have here for lawyer is nomikos, from nomos, according to the law, an expert in the law. So yeah, a lawyer is an expert in the law, but when we're talking about the law here, it means more than just the particular law of like property and stuff. Like that was part of it, but also it was about the religious law as well as just like the law about who owns stuff and who's in charge of stuff. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. Ellis says, I'm hearing some hesitation in the you have given the right answer, like there's a but in it. Sometimes I say things like that as an educator right before correction happens. Yeah, so what we've got here is, he says, teacher, what do I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, what is written in the law? What do you read there? So it's interesting that Jesus is, first of all, throwing it back to the person who's asked and said, hey, in your specific discipline, what do you think? And it makes me wonder what Jesus would have done if it wasn't a lawyer who'd come and ask this question. What if it was a farmer who'd come and ask this question? Would Jesus push back to something else? Is it because this person is an expert in this thing that Jesus says it? Or is it because Jesus is a good Jewish boy and he knows like the answer to things about life are going to be in the Torah, right? In the scriptures. So either one of those, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. But so Jesus says, what do you read there? And then the lawyer says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus says, you have given the right answer, do this and you will live. And yeah, Ellis, there's this sense of like, it's not the end of the conversation. Like, I think that's maybe what I'm hearing too, that maybe is the same as what you're hearing. That Jesus, it sounds like a fake end of a conversation. Like Jesus is saying like, yeah, you're right. But he's not completely shutting it down and saying, and that's the end of the lesson, right? There's something open-ended about it. Oh, I missed Robin's message. Robin, let us know what you were thinking if you want to. I think the thing that's important to know about this sort of rhetorical device that's going on here, the kind of conversation that they're having, is that this is a very common way that you would have philosophical discussions in this part of the world at this time. Usually what would happen is that you would have somebody who would ask a question, and actually I have the actual format here in front of me in one of the commentaries I'm reading. Okay, so you would have an important question is raised, and then there's a counter question, and then an answer, and then there would be an invitation after the answer to reopen the debate with another question. So the idea is that you'd go like question, counter question, answer, pause, and then another question, a counter question, answer. So this was kind of like the way that the argument was created. So somebody would say, like, what is the meaning of life? And then maybe the person on the other side of the argument would say, like, well, what isn't the meaning of life? Like, they would ask some kind of counter question. And the idea wasn't that you were supposed to have one answer, or one question and one answer. The idea was that you were supposed to keep spinning it. Like, you're supposed to keep this top spinning, which is really interesting as a way to have a conversation, right? To not think that there is one absolute right answer. So maybe what you're sensing there, Ellis, is that idea of, like, somebody gives a... Jesus isn't shutting down the conversation, he's opening it up for another question, which is exactly what happens in the next text. I'm seeing weird message retracted things for Robin and Taylor's comments, and I don't know why that's happening unless you all are doing it yourself. So if you all are doing it yourself, go for it. Do what you got to do. But I want to make sure that nobody's getting their messages taken out if they don't mean to. So let me know if there's something weird going on there. So the last thing I want to kind of think about for a second before we move on to the rest of the passage is the way that Jesus talks about how you're supposed to love God or how you're supposed to love God specifically, because I think that list that he gives is a really interesting one. So Jesus says, you shall love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. So that's 4 things, right? And I think the thing that, I don't know if this happens to you all, but when I think about this passage, I forget about the strength bit, because I think heart, soul, mind. Like, I think of that sort of, it's sort of a Greek understanding of the world, that they would understand things in terms of, like, your body, your heart, your soul, your mind. Like, it's a way that makes sense to organize the world from a Greek perspective. But the strength thing always throws me off. I'm always like, with all your strength, like, what part of you is that? It doesn't seem like it's sort of the one of these things is not like the other situation, and so the strength one always throws me off. So I wanted to look into more about what was going on with the strength thing. Oh good, Robin said that was you doing that. Cool. As long as that's you all doing that and not some weird mod thing, we're good. So looking at what it means, those different parts of you, to love God with those different parts of you, I went into I always mispronounce this, Hermeneia commentary, which I really like. And I was looking through to see if I could find out what these different parts meant. And this is what I found out. So here's what this commentary says. The listing of these domains serves more as a way of indicating the whole and the intensity of the commitment. Heart refers to your will and emotions, soul to your conscious vitality and spiritual sensitivity, strength to personal energy, and mind to intelligence. So they are kind of thinking, like, in the Hellenistic or in the Greek Jewish world, those were kind of the ways that you'd think about it. So, like, your will, your spiritual sense, your energy, and your intelligence. Like, those are all the things that are kind of being brought into this. Oh, Taylor, good. It was a dog comment. Jude says, strength to me is like an endurance bit. Yeah, I think that's exactly what this commentary is saying, that strength to denote personal energy. Yeah, so it's like kind of what this commentary is saying here in that first sentence where it says, it serves more as a way of indicating the whole and the intensity, right? So it's saying, like, you're loving God with your whole self, not just the whole of parts, but the whole as in the full amount that you can do it. Does that make sense? So yeah, it's an interesting way to describe it, but I always wondered, like, why does that strength thing come in there? It always seemed a little weird to me, so I wanted to know more. Robin says, I notice in Matthew and Mark, Jesus answers lawyers' questions, whereas in Luke, the lawyer answered his own question. Yeah, so that is true. So in the Matthew and Mark texts where the person comes and says, which is the most important commandment, or which is the first commandment, Jesus answers. But in Luke's version, we have the lawyer saying the question, and then Jesus kind of giving that question back. Well, what does the law say? And then the lawyer answering from the law. So Jesus gets him to answer his own question. And we only see that in Luke rather than the way that we see it in Matthew and Mark. And that is very interesting. I think I suspect that what we know about, like, the sort of the Lucan writers or writer, like whether you believe that Luke literally penned the gospel by himself, or whether you believe that it was sort of like several people kind of compiling things in a specific school of thought. Whatever you believe about the writer of this gospel, I think what we're getting out of it is that they seem to be, or he seems to be, much more entrenched in the Greek world of the time. Like there's so many Greek ideas showing up here, like that circling of conversation, like the separation of the self into those different things. These are all very Greek ideas. And so it seems like Luke is sort of coming at this with a slightly different perspective. Yeah. Oh yeah, speaking of cyclical things, Jude says, something I grapple with is stepping back and caring for others in order to care for myself and my faith. Yes, okay, so that's getting into the questions that I want us to start asking. So let's move on into the rest of this story, because we want to get into talking about caring for others, caring for ourselves. What's up with that? And I think we get the first inkling of that in verse 27, where you're supposed to love God with all of who you are and your neighbor as yourself, right? And that sense of like you're supposed to love yourself, right? Like you love your neighbor as yourself assumes that you love yourself. So there's a lot of circular and cyclical things going on here. So let's get into our next section. So we're going to read verses 29 through 37, and this is where the actual story comes in. So Jesus says, "You've given the right answer, do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So, we've got this really interesting story here about what it means to be a neighbor. Now, the first thing that might be helpful for us to know is that the word for neighbor in Greek literally means, like so many of us have grown up in maybe Christian communities that talk about this so much that the word neighbor has come to just mean everybody. But in the Greek, the word neighbor meant somebody nearby you, like physically near you. So it's kind of like the older version of how you'd think of a neighbor, like a person you live next to, right? So when the lawyer says, "Who is my neighbor?" that's like not a ridiculous question to ask. He's literally saying like, well, how close to me do they have to be? Which is an interesting question to ask. Like, just the person living next to me, or the person who lives next to them too, or the person who lives next to them too? Like, he's kind of saying like, where are the boundaries? Paint me some boundaries, Jesus. And that's when Jesus tells this story. Taylor says, "Love your neighbor as yourself when I was growing up was used in a weird way to love others almost to neglecting oneself. So seeing this lately has me thinking about the importance of balance." Absolutely. Yes, we're going to go there. Don't you worry. We're going to go there toward the end of this story. So yeah, that word neighbor, right? It does make sense that the lawyer would say like, well, how close to me do they have to be? One thing, maybe you saw this too as we were reading this text just now, but one thing that this text immediately made me think of is how people are reacting when I go out on my walks every day. I try to go take my dog out for a walk every day, unless it's pouring rain. And right now, when we're trying to social distance and stay 6 feet away from each other, when I and somebody else are on the same sidewalk, one of us will switch over to the other side so that we can stay apart, keep each other safe. And I was thinking about that a lot as I was reading this passage. This idea of these people are on the road, and the Levite and the priest cross over to the other side of the road. And it made me think about having that happen every day for us and what that feels like. That sense of like moving across the road. And to some of us, it feels good because we're like, we're keeping everybody safe. And to others of us, it feels like, oh man, this is weird that people are like giving me this wide berth that makes me feel bad. So if you're having one of those two reactions, the like, yes, we're doing it well, or like, I hate that we keep having to give each other these wide berths, you're not alone. Both of those things are totally normal responses. Julia says, it's also important to know that Samaritans were hated at the time, so it had shock value. Exactly. So when we have this story, like imagine this story being told. This is a classic fairy tale setup here, the story of threes, right? Where you get three people coming along, and the first one does something, and then the second one does a similar thing, and then the third person will either do the same thing to like such a great extent that it really drives the point home, or they'll do something completely different. Like think about the story of the three little pigs, right? In the three little pigs, the first little pig builds his house of, what does he build it of? Straw, and then, is it wood? I forget. But the first two, the big bad wolf comes and blows their house down. The third little pig is the one that builds his house out of bricks, right? And then that house can't be blown down. So it's that same thing where you've got the first two people do a thing, and then the third person comes along and does something different. So the people that Jesus were telling this story to would have been super familiar with that kind of, not because they knew about the three little pigs, very unkosher, but because they would be familiar with a story of threes. And so they would have been expecting the third person to do something different. They would have been like, okay, the priest did this and the Levite did this. They're waiting for the third person to see what the third person does in Jesus' story. One thing that I hadn't thought about, and then it came up in one of the commentaries I was reading, in the Abington commentary, they were talking about how people would be expecting this third person, and how the people that were standing around this conversation might have been like, yeah, those darn priests and Levites, they never do what we want them to. Like, it wasn't just Jesus having a conversation with this lawyer. There were probably other people listening in as well, and they may not all have been super psyched about how the priests and the Levites were acting at that time. It'd be like, people that are generally like, you can't please everybody, right? And so there might have been a sense of like, yeah, that priest and that Levite, they didn't get it. But like, what they might have expected is a individual, like a lay person, a Jewish lay person, not involved with the temple or the government, to be the third person. They would have been like, okay, sure, those big shots, they go first, they don't really understand it, but it's going to be somebody like me that's going to get it. So that's why it's even more weird for the people listening when the third person that comes along is a Samaritan, because Samaritans are not friends of these particular Jewish people. Samaritans were people that lived in Samaria. It was sort of a neighboring bit of the country, and Samaritans worshipped God in a different place. They didn't worship God. They worshipped sort of the same, we would say they worshipped the same God. They would argue about whether it was the same or not. But they essentially worshiped the same God, but in a different place, not in Jerusalem. And so they were seen as this sort of like weird offshoot that weren't really Jewish. They were seen as really negative, right? They were seen as the enemy. And so when the third person that comes along is a Samaritan, that's going to surprise everybody. They're going to be like, wait a minute, the person who does it right is the bad guy? That doesn't seem right. That doesn't fit the story. So that would be a huge surprise. I want to go here to the chat for a second. Robin says, I used to wonder if you could actually love someone if you don't love yourself. I don't think you really can, but I could be wrong. Brian says, I don't love myself entirely, but I do somewhat. I'm able to love in a certain capacity. Yeah, I want to talk more about that, the like balance between whether you can love yourself or let yourself be loved if you don't love yourself. We're going to talk about that. Jude points out that the lawyer doesn't name the Samaritan as a Samaritan at the end, just as the one who helped. Yeah, that is really interesting. And I wonder, I see both Ellis and Jude are talking about this, whether he does that because he doesn't want to say it was a Samaritan that got it right, or because he's trying to emphasize the fact that they're the same, emphasize the similarity. It could be either one. I love that though. So, okay. So we've got this Samaritan that comes along. I got to look at my notes to make sure we're getting everything here. Okay, so thinking about the man who was hurt, right? The man who's lying on the side of the road. one of the reasons I was interested to learn this, one of the reasons I was always told that the priest might have seen this man who was hurt and passed by on the other side is because priests couldn't, well, it was very difficult for them to come into contact with something that was considered unclean, like a dead body. They would have to go through this whole ritual thing in order to go back to their duty as a priest. And so I was always taught that the reason that the priest didn't go to this man who was hurt is because the priest wanted to like keep his ritual cleanliness intact. So that was what I was always taught. Something that I was interested to learn as I was reading through it this time is that there's actually a specific sort of dispensation or a specific loophole for dead bodies. Like the man isn't dead, so like the point's kind of moot. But there's a loophole in the temple system for dead bodies that have been abandoned. If a dead body has been abandoned, a priest is allowed to touch the dead body or to be near the dead body in order to help do things like identify the dead person and help with burial and that, not the actual burial, but help with rituals around burial and that kind of thing. So even if the Levite, or even if the priest walked by this guy and was like, oh, he looks dead, I probably shouldn't touch him, there still would have been a loophole in the law that would have allowed him to go over and see if the guy was actually dead or if he was, like, what was going on. And the fact that the priest doesn't do that is like for me, I was always like, well, if he was trying to do the right thing by like following the rules, then maybe I don't have to be mad at him for doing the wrong thing. But like, he did really choose to do the wrong thing. There was a legal loophole, there was a religious loophole that he could have used to help this guy out, and he chose not to do that. So I thought that was an interesting point that I hadn't heard before, so I wanted to share that with you all. I think it's really important for us in Christian contexts to not sort of point the finger of blame at Jewish religious practices and be like, well, he couldn't do it because he was Jewish and, because of the cleanliness practices. So it's all, Jews' fault. Like, let's not do that. There are always loopholes to help people within Jewish law. And so we want to emphasize the fact that the priest could have helped, but he chose not to. The Levite is another person who would have worked in the temple, so he would have been under slightly different rules, but in both cases, for both of them, they decided not to help. So the third person that comes along will be a Samaritan. It's noticing that the Samaritan chooses to help this person, despite the fact that the Samaritan probably knew that this person was Jewish. I think it would be easy, like, I can imagine being the lawyer who's listening to Jesus tell this story, and for the lawyer to be like, well, he probably didn't even know that the guy on the side of the road was Jewish and not a Samaritan. Like, maybe he was just helping because he didn't know. But realistically, the Jewish folks that lived in Jerusalem dressed different from the Samaritans. They would have looked different. So the Samaritan would have known that this person was a Jew from Jerusalem. I got distracted for a second because I wanted to make sure that he was going from Jerusalem, and he was. He would have known that this person would have been an enemy, and he acted anyways. So I think what I'm trying to get to is that there is a sort of mirror image being held up here, where the priest and the Levite could have acted if they would have wanted to and been completely within the rules of the law to help this guy, and they chose not to intentionally. Whereas the Samaritan would have had all the reason in the world to ignore this guy. Like, all the reason in the world. They're enemies, we don't touch them, we don't go near them. Like, he had all the reasons to not go near this guy and to know better, and he still chose to help anyway. So we've got this foil of each other going on. So yes, that's where I was going with that, is that we've got a foil. So I wonder what else you notice about this bit of the story, this story where this person is hurt, and the two other people come by, and then the Samaritan finally comes by. Couple little random things of note. We talked, was it 2 weeks ago or a month ago, when we talked about Jesus mourning Lazarus? There was that bit where Jesus is moved with pity, and it's like that moaning sort of thing going on. We notice a similar thing going on with the Samaritan. It says he was moved with pity, and the Greek there is like his intestines were moved, is essentially what the Greek is saying. Like he was feeling a gut reaction to this person. And I always think that that's interesting when we see somebody have a gut reaction, like a bit of your conscience being like, do something, and the Samaritan responds to that. Carolyn says, if the person was aware or awake, would they have willingly accepted help from the Samaritan? That is a good question. It's something that we're not told distinctly, because we're told that he's half dead, right? And then we're told that the Samaritan goes to him and bandages his wounds, pours oil and wine on them, which they considered, like wine is a disinfectant in some ways, right? So that was what you would normally do for wounds. Put him on his own animal, brought him to the inn, took care of him. And we don't know, like when it says half dead, like was he in a coma maybe? We don't really know if he was totally aware of what was going on. So would he have accepted help? That is a really good question. And I think it's a question that is worth asking when we think about this metaphor for our experience right now. When are we okay with accepting help, especially accepting help from people that we would consider to be enemies? I'm losing my voice a little bit here. So that's kind of the first question that I want us to ask about this bit of the story. I want us to take turns putting ourselves in different people's shoes in this story for the rest of our hour here, for the next 15 minutes or so. I want us to put ourselves in these different people's shoes and think about what we would do or how it relates to what we're going through today. So first person we're going to put ourselves in the shoes of, thanks to Carolyn here, is the man who is hurt, right? The man who is beaten and hurt. For some of us, we are definitely feeling that right now. We are definitely in the place where we are like, I am hurt and I can't do anything and I'm half dead and I'm kind of in a coma, right? For some of us, that is the way things feel right now. So here's some questions for us. Like Carolyn said, when do we accept help? This is something that we talked about in one of our support groups last week. We talked about the act of accepting help or reaching out for support and how we let ourselves do that or not do that. In the shoes of the Samaritan, I think our question is, when do we let ourselves be cared for? And when do we let ourselves be cared for by people we maybe don't like very much? I think it's easier for us to accept help from people that we already care about and we already have a positive relationship with. It's one step harder to do that with people that we don't know, like when you're out looking for a new therapist or something. That's hard. It is probably the most hard when we have to admit that we need help from people we don't like. So what would it be like for the Samaritan or for the hurt man to wake up and realize that it's this Samaritan taking care of him? I don't know. I don't know how he felt about that. So what do you all think? In the shoes of the Samaritan, or in the shoes of the hurt man, what would you be thinking about this? How do you decide when to accept help? So that's our first question for us as we think about this. When do you accept help? How do you accept help from people that you don't like? Is that an easy thing to do for you? What's that experience like? I think for me, it's a humbling experience, right? Think about like working on a group project with somebody that you don't like, that you got put in a group with, and they are maybe really good at whatever it is you're working on. Accepting that they might be better than you at something or you might need something from them is humbling. It makes you go, dang it. I don't like you, but I recognize that I need your help. And it takes some humility to be able to accept that. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough. If there are not any immediate thoughts about the man who is hurt, I'm going to move us to our next person. But we can feel free to go back to thinking about being in the shoes of that hurt person, if that's something that makes sense for anybody. Let's put ourselves then for a second in the shoes of the priest and the Levite. Are there places in our life right now where we see suffering and we pass by on the other side? And we maybe feel like we have a good reason to do that. We maybe feel like that's maybe the better thing to do. I I think, I mean, like I was talking about with that sense of like going for walks and whatever, I think there are definitely times right now where I feel overwhelmed by the world and what's going on. And I feel like I need to stop looking for a little while. And I feel bad about that. Like there's definitely some guilt around that, right? About like I need to close my eyes for a minute so that I can like get recentered. And I wonder when that is me just making sure that I can keep going and when that is me being the priest or the Levite. I think there's a fine line there. Because we definitely do have to take breaks from the work of the world. We definitely do have to do that. But maybe the difference there is if you are a person who needs to be like taking a break and just like recentering yourself, maybe you wouldn't even be on that road, right? Maybe you'd be at home by yourself, taking care of yourself. Maybe the very fact that these people are out making a journey from Jericho to Jerusalem and back again is because they already have the ability, like they already have the resources to do that. They have the resources to help. So maybe it's the difference between like, if you're at home taking care of yourself, that's what you got to do. If you're out on the road and you see something that you can do something about and you have the resources to do something about it, that's when you do it. But we can't always be on the road. Sometimes we have to be at home. Carolyn says, another question. If the priest or Levite saw a Samaritan helping a Jew, would they have let it happen or would they have interrupted and helped instead? That is a good question, Carolyn. I don't know. I think that probably would have depended on the person, right? They may have been like, no, let us do it. I wonder, too, if the Samaritan would have helped if the priest or the Levite had been around. Probably not, right? Because if you saw your enemy hurt on the ground, but you saw one of their own people was helping them, you might be like, well, then they don't need me, right? It seems like the Samaritan was acting because he saw nobody else around. But in the other, like, have that turned around? I'm not sure. Julia says, I'm affirming an ace. I'm often told I can't be Christian and I will go to hell no matter what. I no longer care at this point. I rather live in truth and go to hell than to live a lie and go to heaven. That's tough, Julia. It is tough. I think living in the truth makes sense, especially considering what Jesus says about being the way, the truth, and the life, right? Makes sense to me. Taylor says, this is a really weird place for me right now. When people find out that I'm a therapist, they sometimes want me to be their therapist because the world is so on fire, but with everything else going on. Yeah, I know. So Taylor, that's that sense of like being expected to always be on the road, right? Being expected to always be out there doing stuff. And you can't. Nobody can. Nobody can always be out on the road ready to do stuff. We just can't. Robin says, I was going to say that the priest and Levite would represent those who have resources and knowledge of how to help but choose not to. Yeah, I think that's accurate, Robin. Oh, I see. Julia says, so no, I wouldn't accept help from a non-affirming Christian because the love feels abusive. So it saddens me that I don't know how to love my non-affirming brothers and sisters. Yeah, I think, that's an interesting point, Julia. I think the difference is what you said there, that sometimes the love from our enemies can be abusive. I think the difference here is that the Good Samaritan is giving this person who is hurt exactly what they need. He's not saying, I'm going to heal you and I'm going to give you a bunch of theology and you better come and worship with me in Samaria, right? Like there's not a weird bait and switch going. He's just doing exactly what the hurt person needs, which is bandage him up so he doesn't bleed out and take him to an inn where he can be taken care of, right? So he's doing what the person actually needs. So it'd be like a non-affirming Christian coming to you and saying, hey, what do you actually need? How can I get you the support you need? How can I find you the groups you need? How can I make sure that you have food to eat and shelter? Like, I think love can be so ephemeral, but this is very distinct, tangible care for a person's body, right? And it's something that everybody needs. So yeah, I feel like that's another interesting equalizing factor in this story, is that it's not about theology. It's about what a person's body needs, and we all have bodies. Anyways, Taylor says, having a difficult time being able to be fully empathetic and therapeutic. Also, it isn't ethical for me to be able to be everyone's therapist and emotionally not possible. Absolutely. Robin says, concerning accepting help, my personal rule is as long as the person helping doesn't have strings attached with their help, I'm willing to accept it. It's hard for me to accept help because it seems like those who want to help could be expecting something in return that I wouldn't be able to pay. Yeah, right. Robin, I think I shouldn't say we all. I think it's often true that when we accept help from somebody, we expect to be in their debt, right? And so I find it interesting that the end of this story, right? What happens at the end of this story? The Samaritan puts the hurt man on his own animal, brings him to him and takes care of him. And then the next day, he takes out money, gives it to the innkeeper and says, take care of him. And when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. So it's interesting to me because the Samaritan is not only not asking for anything in return, he is going and saying, like, it's not just what I'm spending now, but I'm also going to spend more later. It's like the opposite of strings attached. And it's a really interesting thing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Ellis points out that that's also a big cultural thing, right? That sense of expecting to be paid back. I want to focus now for a second on the Samaritan. Let's put ourselves in the Samaritan's shoes. We've talked about the hurt man. We've talked about the priest and the Levi. Let's put ourselves in the Samaritan's shoes. When does the Samaritan decide what the limits of his help are? And I think this kind of goes to what Taylor was talking about. The Samaritan's help is huge and amazing, but it does have limits, right? The Samaritan doesn't say, I'm going to take you all the way back to my house and care for you forever until you're well again, right? The Samaritan doesn't say, I'm going to now put off my journey and stay with this person at the inn and take care of him myself, right? The Samaritan doesn't say, I am now going to be attached to you for the rest of my life and I'm going to go check up on you and your kids. Like, the Samaritan's help has limits. He says, I'm going to help with what you need in this exact moment by bandaging you up so you don't bleed everywhere. And then I'm going to take you to somebody else who is better qualified to help you. And I think that's really, really important for us to remember. That this is not a story about somebody who is helping and helping and helping until they just bleed out, right? That's not what this is about. Even the Good Samaritan puts boundaries and limits on that help that he's providing. And it's not boundaries and limits that are, they're not unrealistic boundaries. Like, he does so much. He says, when I come back, I'll continue to pay for this, right? So it's extravagant in one way, but it's also maybe way less than he could have done, right? He could have theoretically done more, and he doesn't. And I just think that's really important to notice. Ella says, he doesn't say to stay to personally see to the man's wounds. He apparently has someplace to be. Yeah. Jude says, we love healthy boundaries. I think it's just really important to notice that. So let's look again at, I want to just read this section, and I want us to put ourselves in the shoes of the Samaritan and think for a second about where the actions of care are and where the boundaries are. So let's think about those things. What is the Samaritan doing that is an active moment of caring? And then what are the boundaries that he's setting and saying, okay, this is kind of where my job ends. So let's read this again with that in mind. Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? So keeping that in mind, keeping in mind what the Samaritan does, and then the boundaries that the Samaritan sets, where are you seeing boundaries that the Samaritan is setting, and where are you seeing like the sort of differences that we're seeing here between what the Samaritan could have done and what he chooses to do? I think the fact that Jesus points us to this story and tells this story and shows us what love of neighbor looks like, but doesn't make the Samaritan a superhero, is really important. Jesus is not giving us, even though he's telling us this fairy tale where we've got the three people, right? Jesus is not giving us something, he's not giving us an unrealistic example. Because he could have done that. He could have given us a totally unrealistic example of like, this is what being a perfect neighbor looks like. But instead of doing that, he's like, this is what a person who is moved and has a conscience would do. They would stop the bleeding and they would get him to essentially a hospital. Stop the bleeding, get him to a hospital, pay for his hospital bills because he had the means to do that. And that sort of boundary, I think, is really cool that Jesus sort of explains that. Yeah, Robin says, in a way, the Samaritan does what's within his means. Exactly. The Samaritan's means are, I have some stuff I can bandage him with, I have a donkey or some sort of animal that I can carry him with, and I have money. So, like, we can almost use the Samaritan's example when we think about what we can do, right? What we can do when we see bad things happening. Maybe the first thing the Samaritan does is look around him and goes, okay, what do I have? Do I have any bandages? Do I have any? So imagine that. Imagine the Samaritan sees the man hurt and then goes, what do I have that I can do with this? And if he's got some bandages, he probably just like ripped up some clothes. He's got an animal to get him somewhere fast, and he's got money. That's what he can do, and he does it. So when I see something terrible happening and I see somebody who's hurt, I go, what do I have? What do I have that I can use? And he doesn't go beyond what he has, right? He doesn't promise the hurt man more than he can give. And I think that's important for us when we think about how we help people, right? For instance, I get people emailing me all the time, right? I get trans folks, gender expansive folks emailing all the time to like my personal stuff and also to stuff through TMC, and they need help. They want like help, right? I can promise them a certain amount of help. I can say, here's support groups, here's therapists. I can like listen to your story for a little bit. There are ways that I can help, but at some point I have to go, and that's all I can do. I'm just one human being. This is all I've got, right? And by not overextending ourselves, we don't accidentally put ourselves in a position where we can't help the next person. Speaking of emergencies, I don't know if you can hear that or not, but I've got a fire truck going by my house right now. Taylor says, the Samaritan doesn't stop living his life to take care of the other man. Yeah, agreed. And Ella says he presumably isn't taking that money out of his food budget, as it were. Exactly. I mean, maybe a little bit. Like, we definitely have examples in the Gospels and in the Bible in general of people taking a little bit out of what they have, right? Like the story of, I don't remember what it's called, not in the King James Version, but the story of the widow's mite, where you've got this widow who doesn't really have anything to her name, and she gives like her last copper penny, right? And so there are examples of people giving basically all they have, but then there are also examples of people setting these good boundaries. And I think we, as Christians and as people who read these stories a lot, we tend to focus on those examples of people just giving everything that they have way more often than we focus on the people with the good boundaries. So I think it's something that we need to be aware of. Oh, good, Robin. You heard the fire truck too? It's passed by now. Hopefully everybody's okay. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about tonight, is sort of putting ourselves in these different positions. One of the other questions that I wanted us to ask, and I think it's just a good question to ask, I think Did we 2 weeks ago, I think, talk about liberation theology? And one of the questions that liberation theology likes to ask about texts is, who are we not seeing, or who are we not thinking about in this text? And one of the people that I always am like, oh, I haven't thought about them, is the innkeeper. I wonder how the innkeeper dealt with all of this. That a Samaritan brings in a Jewish guy who's like nearly dead. What does the innkeeper do? Does the innkeeper want to call the authorities on the Samaritan, thinking the Samaritan hurt this guy? Like, I think that's definitely, because if the innkeeper, like, is the innkeeper a Samaritan or is the innkeeper Jewish, right? Because if the innkeeper is a Samaritan, then it would be weird that the Good Samaritan would bring the Jewish guy there. That seems weird. But if the innkeeper is a Jewish person, he's going to already have some biases about this Samaritan when he walks in. He's going to already be thinking bad stuff about this guy. And that's a dangerous situation, right? That we see that all the time in like racial biases, right? Somebody's just going about their life and we think something bad of them, right? So even thinking about the innkeeper as a person to put yourself in the shoes of, I think is an important moment for this story. Ella says, there's a tension between this story where there are boundaries and greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends, and I don't know how to resolve that tension. Exactly. I think the fact that there are these two different sort of versions of stories in Scripture speaks to the fact that we live in different scenarios. In some scenarios, one of these things is going to make more sense than the other. One of these is going to be the thing and not the other. But finding out in our life which scenario is which is really difficult. It's really difficult to know when you're supposed to give everything and when you're supposed to hold on to your boundaries so that you can keep going. And it's definitely something that we're all having to work through all the time. Ooh, yeah, Ella says the innkeeper is probably thinking, can I trust this person to repay me like he says he will? Yeah, probably the innkeeper is most concerned about getting paid for the care. But yeah, so those are the thoughts. Let's see, was there anything that I missed? Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. Well, it's not everything. You can go on about this forever. The fact that that this story is all based upon the original question, what must I do to inherit eternal life, is something that's worth thinking about. Because we usually connect eternal life with the story of like God's mercy, or we need we connect it with the theology that says that like we've been in God's debt and God has to fix that, maybe through like sacrificing Jesus or something like that. But in this story, Jesus says the only way to eternal life is to show care for others. And that's a weird one. It's a weird one to try to square with things about like, are we saved through grace or through works, right? But anyways, it's interesting to think that this is all in response to the question, what do you do to gain eternal life? And Jesus says, you care for people in the way that they actually need to be cared for, not the way that you think is best for them. So anyways, Julia says the innkeeper is a resource that the Samaritan uses to heal the man. Yeah, so, so I don't really think he used a lot of boundaries. Interesting, Julia. I think the boundary that I was kind of pointing to there is that the man could have the Samaritan could have canceled his whole trip and stayed with the man until he was better. Or he could have taken the man back to his own house and taken care of him there. And instead of doing that, he refers him to the innkeeper, essentially. So as it's like a similar example, we might be faced with, so for instance, for me, right, I might be faced with somebody who emails me and is asking me to help them with something. I might not be capable of helping them with that thing, so I refer them to a place that actually does. And that's a way of creating good boundaries, to not promise that I can fix something that I can't fix. The Samaritan's not promising to fix things he can't fix, and that's another good way of setting a boundary. So that's kind of what I meant by that. I hope that makes sense. So, all right. We started a little late, so we're ending a little late, but thanks for sticking with me. I'm glad that you all were here. Thank you for being part of the Bible study tonight. This was a good one, and I hope it'll be something that we all think about as we think about giving help and receiving help and being good neighbors. Right now, for me, being a good neighbor means wearing a mask when I go places, because masks are not about you not getting sick. It's all about protecting other people. So wear a mask to protect your neighbor. It's about social distancing to protect my neighbor. It's about trying to get groceries for people that maybe can't go out because they need to isolate because they have a compromised immune system. It means contacting my actual neighbors in the building I live in to make sure that nobody needs anything. There are lots of good ways to be good neighbors, and while still taking care of ourselves. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you all for being here tonight. This was really fun. Our next Bible study will be happening on June 1st. June 1st will be our next Bible study. This week, the other things we have going on, we have a support group tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. And then on Thursday, we have 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. 2 support groups tomorrow and Thursday. So if you want to get involved with those, you can go to our website and find out more. And that link is in the description below. Otherwise, I will see you all soon. Thanks for being here. And take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Take care of yourself. We can do both. We can be all right. Have a good night, everybody. Peace.